Hi there, and welcome to the first in our new series of live discussion panels on politics in the news. And the idea of this regular bi-weekly, every 2 weeks, session during term time as we get together with some experienced A-level politics teachers. Today we've got two joining us, Duncan on the left, Clive on the right. So good afternoon, gents.
Hi.
And the idea is that we spent about half an hour or so doing a quick whiz through 3 or 4 topical politics news stories, but with two thoughts in mind. One is to try to link them back to your A-level politics studies to see how you might be able to use them, perhaps as an example to develop in your responses, in questions and essays and what have you, but also to get your thoughts and your views on these topics. And the way you can do that is by using the live chat window. If you're joining us live on Facebook, type in your question, your observation, your opinions, or whatever. If you want to ask Clive and Duncan something, use the live chat. If you want to add your opinion, use the live chat as well. And what I'll do, I'll be watching in the background and I'll try to pick out some questions and some comments to add to the screen. I think we're all set, Dunks, I think?
Yeah, great stuff. So it's going to be as big a surprise to me and Clive as it is to you. What comes up on the screen as our first story?
Who knows? We never prepare the presenters on this. It's a complete surprise, isn't it, Duncan?
Absolutely.
Okay.
What could it be? Here we go. Oh, ooh. Johnson's reshuffle. So this feels like a long time ago now, but obviously, ordinarily we'd be talking about sort of 2 weeks worth of news, and it's probably about that since this happened. When Boris Johnson reshuffled his cabinet, quite a significant reshuffle, and I was wondering, Clive, what you think about this in terms of what it says about the power of the Prime Minister in some ways, because on the one hand it shows that he's able to reshuffle his cabinet and change around, but a lot of these people seem to be people that we think of as being Boris Johnson's allies or have been historically, so I wonder whether it shows strength or weakness of the Prime Minister. That's my first thought. Do you have any thoughts, Clive?
Well, despite what Jim said, I did a bit of research between this and thinking about what some of the questions may be, and I was absolutely amazed to read that apparently Johnson's had 27 sackings in the 2 years or so he's been prime minister.
Wow.
Because one of the things which perhaps he could be criticised on would be being overly loyal. You think how long it took for Matt Hancock to either resign or sack, depending on which side of the
Mm.
story you take. His unfailing support for Priti Patel, despite her alleged, careful my terms here, breaching the ministerial code several
Yeah.
times. And yet, I think it was in the Daily Express, they said that this was a blood transfusion rather than a bit of gentle surgery. And it was a massive show of his power and the fact that he is, it would appear, despite the sort of the bumbling character he likes to portray, extremely ruthless in the way he actually made this reshuffle. So in terms of
Right.
have we got cabinet government, have we got prime ministerial government? Currently, it would appear that my friend Mr. Johnson, refuse to call him Boris because he's Alexander on the school records, that Mr. Johnson really exhibited prime minister power in a massive scale.
Right. Yeah. That's interesting, isn't it? Because I mean, absolutely, it's a big reshuffle, isn't it? And big names went, and some of them went completely, not just a demotion. Like, I mean, as you're saying, you sort of showed loyalty to Matt Hancock for a long time. Similarly, Gavin Williamson sort of probably lasted in the education secretary job than perhaps longer than some teachers would have liked. But I suppose that's true of all education secretaries to a certain extent, isn't it? But he was there a long time. But he's gone completely, and I think he was Boris's kind of campaign manager when he was. I've said Boris, and I mean not to. I agree with you. It's Alexander's, Mr. Pfeffel's
Yeah,
campaign manager, wasn't he, when he was standing to be leader of the Conservative Party, and so it's not just getting rid of what we might see as underperforming ministers or failing ministers, but also people who are thought of as his allies, I suppose, and that's quite an interesting take. Um, there was some uh, feeling about what would happen with Dominic Raab,
yeah,
and I suppose you could see maybe is that a sign of not total power because you get the impression Dominic Raab negotiated a bit to get the deputy prime minister job and another good um, cabinet job. So although he was demoted in the sense that he lost one of the big three posts, he sort of saved face a little bit
yeah.
by
There were reports,
getting.
weren't there, that he threw the toys out of the pram big time,
Mm,
Dominic Raab. And a lot of
yeah,
people felt sorry for Robert Buckland as Justice Secretary for having to be eased out to be replaced by Dominic Raab, who I think was
yes,
described as a senior lawyer. And a lot of people in the
mm,
legal world got onto social media fairly quickly to say, in their opinion, he wasn't a senior lawyer, whereas Robert Buckland
right,
had actually been a judge. I think the other interesting one is Liz Truss,
yeah,
because
big,
a lot of people saying having her in one of the more major positions as Foreign Secretary is part of Johnson acknowledging that the only potential threats to his leadership from the cabinet come from the Chancellor and Liz Truss, who apparently had
right.
had a big ruck with Mrs. Johnson, Carrie
Oh,
Antoinette.
really?
Apparently she's been referred to over the
Yeah,
Australian trade deal because of the uh, lack of care of animals, which obviously Carrie Johnson is very keen to portray. So it's kind of
yeah.
interesting, isn't it? It's the American president idea of far better to have people inside your tent than outside your tent, whatever that
Well,
quote.
yes, yeah.
But you
Yeah.
know it obviously.
Um, I do know they're great. Yeah, so the I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because that's the kind of big beast thing, isn't it? I suppose about
Yeah.
so it's not total power for the prime minister because he's had to keep Dominic Raab on
Mm.
side to a certain extent. As you say, promotion for Liz Truss is that because she's a threat if she doesn't get a big promotion. Although I've got to say that she's is it second ever
Yeah. Following Margaret
woman
Beckett, wasn't it?
woman to be foreign secretary. So
Yeah.
that's a
Yeah.
big achievement. Um, no move for Rishi Sunak. You wouldn't necessarily have expected there to be one, but again, that's the sort of keeping the big beasts happy. Michael Gove was an interesting
Yeah.
move. People were because was that a demotion? Was it a it's a it's. I think
Yeah.
he's sort of spun it as a promotion because it's going to be an important role in the coming.
They renamed the department, haven't they, to the Department of Leveling Up Housing and Communities. And Andy Burnham actually praised Gove today, which seems a bit counterintuitive. He's actually said the one thing about Gove is you may not like what he does, but at least he comes to the department and he does something.
Well,
now, as a former teacher,
yes, I was going to say, it's not
what he did in education, but
it's not always a good thing for ministers to have lots of ideas,
No.
but he does come in with an agenda, doesn't he? It's so. I mean, if you get that kind of classic, is the Prime Minister too powerful, not powerful enough? Is it Prime Ministerial government or cabinet government or whatever? It's a good example to use for that, but possibly to use things on both sides of the argument, actually, that there's both the powers of the Prime Minister to do this big wholesale reshuffle, but also some of the limitations on there. He can't necessarily put exactly who he wants, where he wants, and get rid of who he'd like. There are some restrictions and limitations.
Still constraints, aren't there, and having to achieve some sort of balance. But yes, I think interesting days ahead. And it's always interesting from my point of view, watching Sky News or BBC News, other outlets obviously available, to see which minister is being put out to quell the fire, as it were. And over the last 48, 72 hours, there doesn't seem to be an awful lot of ministers appearing to discuss this non-existent fuel shortage, which means I'm trapped at home because I can't get petrol.
Oh no! I mean, which is another story we could potentially have discussed today. Obviously, the fuel shortage and the government, what the government can do about it. But it's, I'm not sure that one made the cut. We'll see. But so the reshuffles. It's an interesting one, and I think it's really useful for that. That question. Get questions about the cabinet, about the role of government ministers. You always get I always find you particularly get it in sort of media and things when someone gets a job who doesn't have a background in that area. People always discuss, is it so the new education secretary, is it Nadine Zahawi? He's not really doesn't have an educational type background, and so people say, do you need to be a specialist to be? And I think that's quite an interesting one with government ministers, because you don't tend to. I mean, there was discussion about obviously how senior a solicitor Dominic Raab would be. Do you need to be a specialist in the role to be a government minister? I remember Tony Blair made Alan Johnson higher education minister, and he was the only minister in the government not to have gone to university. It's quite an interesting, take to sort of think you want to possibly someone who's got a different perspective and hasn't got that background. Shall we see what the next headline is? Oh, we've redacted some of it, so we added a little bit of a quiz challenge here. Can people watching work out what's behind the black lines on the?
Can I work out?
Or can you? Blank blank stakes reputation on 12 billion fix for blank and blank blank. So it's a real newspaper headline. Can anyone work out what possibly some of the blanks might be covering? What's had a 12 billion pound fix over the last week or so, or been promised one? So we've mentioned the what's covered up by the first two words. There was tutor to you suggesting health could be one of the words. I think one of them could well be health. The first two I think might be someone's name. We've already debated whether we should call him by his first name. So there's a big clue. Boris Johnson stakes a reputation on £12 billion fix for health and social care. And I think this one's quite an interesting one there's lots of ways it's interesting, but quite interesting for ideologies and conservatism. There's been a lot of discussion in perhaps some of the more right-leaning newspapers and conservative newspapers about whether the government is the low tax party, the Conservative Party, the party of low taxes, because this is a pretty big increase in national insurance countries. Eventually, it's going to become this health and social care levy, which it's the same thing really, essentially, but it's going to pay for it. And does it fix the problem? That's the other angle. Looking at it policy-wise. So, parties for a long time, both main parties and other parties have been talking about the need to do something about funding of health and social care. It's been in all governments' parties' manifestos for quite some time. So there's a talk about integrating health and social care, having, I think it was Labour the last couple of elections, it's talked about a national care service. And the issue's always been really about the funding for it, and one of the big issues certainly that's been raised by Conservative ministers has been about people having to sell their homes to pay for social care and things like that, and wanting to try and come up with a policy that avoids that. And then obviously there's sort of the NHS needing extra resources, particularly following the pandemic as well. So there's a big need for some funding. So I suppose there are various questions. Is this the right way to do it? Is this the Conservative way to do it? Is it from an ideology's perspective? Will it work? Lots of aspects to this. It's a big increase in tax, isn't it? And on sort of, I suppose, what we might say, ordinary workers, right? It's not a progressive tax in the way that sort of income tax is. You don't pay a higher rate the more. I mean, obviously, it's a higher percent. It's a percentage of a larger amount, so you pay more. But it's not a higher rate the more you earn in the way that income tax is. So there was criticisms in the whole context of the kind of levelling up and all that kind of thing, that this is a burden on middle earners, if you like. Do you think that's a fair criticism or a problem for the government?
It's one of the interesting ones, isn't it? Where I'm not a great economist, big time. You should look at my own private bank account for that. But the claim is a 1.25% increase. Some critics say, well, actually, it's not, because it's a 1.25% increase on the current rate of national insurance, which, if you look at it in a different statistical way, is actually 10%. And
yes, so it's a 1.2 percentage points, isn't it, rather than a percentage increase? Yeah, so it is a misleading description of it as that.
And the people who are most likely to be impacted by that are younger people on lower incomes, and obviously the one which they portrayed a lot in the left-wing media were people working in the health service, who we clapped for vigorously last year.
Yeah.
But then, arguably, this year, the rate of inflation is now likely to be 4%. A nurse's pay rise is 3%, and then you put this on top of that.
Yeah.
Then actually, you could argue the Conservative Party's policies currently would not appear to be appealing to the youth voter. But then again, some people will then contend, well, do they need to appeal to the youth voter? Because when you look at the demographic of voting, the 18 to, I think it's now 47 is the dividing line, where people by age are more likely to vote for Conservative than Labour. So bringing it into the party politics and looking at election demographics, you could say, well, they can do this sort of policy because they're not particularly influencing those who they have as their core support, I guess. The other thing, that the big question is, does it solve the problem in the National Health Service and social care? For the first 3 years, I think they plan to raise £36 billion, which they say will all go to the National Health Service. So it doesn't actually tackle the problem, from my perspective, of social care, which Mr. Johnson promised he would do on July the 24th, 2019, in his first address outside Downing Street.
Yes.
So, again, depends on your political perspective, but I would argue this is not actually getting to the core of the problem of social care. But Conservatives say, well, Labour, what's your plan?
I mean, that's an interesting point. I was just quickly on the Boris Johnson point. He did say on the steps of Downing Street, didn't he, that they already had a plan for it, and he kind of assumed that this wasn't that plan, because they also said they wouldn't be putting up national insurance. So what the plan was is interesting. Obviously, if there was a plan, it got dropped at some point.
I wrote the quote just in case this came up.
Yeah,
and the quote was, "We will fix the crisis in social care once and for all, and we have a clear plan prepared." And I think most of us are thinking, well, that's not necessarily absolutely accurate.
Possibly not. No, I mean, but you raise the interesting point about what would another party do, what would Labour do? Because there was a lot of talk about a wealth tax, and obviously that's controversial. There have been issues in the past, aren't there, about sort of mansion taxes and things like that. But the idea that you could tax wealth or assets rather than income. But the Labour Party seems to have not totally sort of, they've kind of been hedging their bets a little bit on this, haven't they? They've
Yeah.
reluctant to say that that's what they do. So they've been critical of the government for breaking their pledge not to raise national insurance, but have been pretty cagey about how they would fund it themselves. So, I mean, of course, that's always a problem for opposition parties because they don't. It isn't their responsibility to do it because they're not going to do it. You don't necessarily want to commit to something that's going to get used against you. At the same time, it's hard to criticise too strongly if you haven't got a clear alternative.
Very nice quote I thought from Rachel Reeves today, talking at a Labour conference and referencing Jeff Bezos. And the quote was along the lines: "If you can afford to go to the moon, you can afford to pay taxes on Earth." I think that's the way they are inferring or alluding that they will try and get some taxation,
Yes.
and it is through these large corporates and to the Amazons of the world, the Facebooks, and so on and so forth.
Yes, and I suppose that's been the line for a while, hasn't it? About collecting more of the tax that is owed and isn't paid for various reasons, as filling some of these gaps. I guess the other, I suppose, issue about kind of a wealth or asset tax is that older people would pay more of that probably. It would because one, as you say, it's mainly younger people with the national insurance because they don't pay it over a certain age. So there's lots there in terms of where it could come up. So I've mentioned it could come up in a ideologies type question because if you're thinking about conservatism and economics and a conservative view of economics, you tend to think in sort of modern conservatism, new right conservatism tends to be low tax. Is this more of a one nation type approach to say we want the state to come in and help with paying for social care, that aspect of it, or is it just pragmatic? This is a solution to a problem that exists, not particularly ideological at all. So you could potentially see it in both those ways. So I think that's quite interesting. I mean, is there a free market answer? I suppose the free market in care has shown is the problem, isn't it? In a way, that's what hasn't worked, arguably.
I guess also in exam terminology, you can refer to the limited mandate, and the idea that once in government, you have the doctor's mandate, where you respond to circumstances rather than being hair-bound to whatever you wrote in your manifesto.
Yes.
Obviously, Johnson was saying we couldn't predict the pandemic, therefore we are now having to revise or reverse some of the things we said prior to the election.
Absolutely, but it does raise the question of what was this plan for social care that we may never know. We may never know. Okay, but that's an interesting story. We've got another one coming up. Confrontations. So we've been talking about the Conservative Party. We thought we'd just turn our attention to Labour now. Do please, by the way, if you're watching, do chip in with your thoughts and questions. It'd be great to hear from you. When I first thought we might do something on this last week, it was all about the decision to stop using OMOV, one member, one vote, to vote for leaders and go back to the Electoral College. But of course, that got dropped over the weekend once there were meetings between Keir Starmer and some trade union leaders, and the trade unions weren't keen on being sort of bounced into such a significant change, even though it was one that arguably benefited them. If you went back to the Electoral College, then the trade unions would have a third of the vote for the leader. But in the end, they haven't done that. They've stuck with one member, one vote. But what they have done is, and has been agreed and has been voted on by a conference, although it was quite narrow, is to raise the nomination threshold. It all sounds quite arcane stuff, and that's another point, really. Is it what parties should be talking about at the moment? Is it the outward-looking focus that you'd want necessarily when there's a crisis in the with the fuel and all that kind of thing? But it's 20% of Labour MPs now have to nominate before someone's on the ballot paper, and the theory behind that is that would stop a sort of Jeremy Corbyn or a future person who may have support amongst the members but doesn't have the same sort of support amongst MPs from getting onto the ballot paper at all. And so it kind of affects who could be elected leader in the future. It's not that long since that threshold got put down to 10%. That was a reform in the last sort of few years, but I think it was 15% before that. So it is putting up higher than it used to be. There was an interesting thing I saw that if that had been the case, say for example when Keir Starmer was elected, he would have been elected unopposed. No one else got that many nominations. I mean, obviously people may have nominated differently if under a different system, but assuming people nominated in the same way, Keir Starmer would have been elected unopposed. As would in the previous one, it would have been Andy Burnham against Yvette Cooper. They would have been the only two to be nominated, and then you'd have just had the two Miliband brothers, the one before that. So it would have made quite a big difference. Retrospectively applied, it would make quite a big difference. There'd only have ever been one woman on as a potential leader candidate. That would have been Yvette Cooper. No other woman would have ever been nominated as a potential Labour leader, and there'd never have been a non-white candidate. So it's interesting when you look at it like that it's quite so what seems like quite an arcane thing is quite significant from two ways. One, it potentially locks out politically niche figures, if you like, so either people from the hard left, or possibly also if you think back to when Jeremy Corbyn was elected, Liz Kendall was the kind of, I suppose you call her a Blairite candidate. She didn't have a huge backing either, so it would possibly lock out people from that, who were sort of on the fringes of the party on either side. I suppose it sort of narrows who could be elected, but that could be seen as a positive thing because then they'd have the confidence of the parliamentary party if they were elected. But it does potentially narrow the choice kind of demographically as well. It's historically at least it would be a lot of white men, I suppose, if we're putting it bluntly. But anyway, it's happening. It has passed. In the end, it was down to very close, and I think it was the Unison delegates who in the end made the difference. The members were slightly in favour of keeping the old system, and in the end, a sort of union bloc vote, if you like, pushed it the other way. So it's quite an interesting thing. So it's seen as a big victory for Keir Starmer. I wonder whether, in some ways, spending the first 3 days of the conference arguing about this kind of thing might not be such a big victory, because it's a kind of missed opportunity to talk about things that probably matter to voters more than how you vote for your leader and how many MPs and all that kind of thing. I don't know. What do you think, Clive?
Well, strangely, it was a 53-47% vote in favour, which is kind of a bit closer to Brexit. And you always wonder whether whether that is actually a massive divide. I mean, they're saying this is a Starmer make or break conference, because when he came in as leader, he was there to unite the party and obviously try and probably dilute the Corbynism that had been there and the power and momentum, which I guess he's still struggling to do. I mean, in terms of an exam question, this is factions or splits, or my favourite word, schisms within the party, and how he's having to deal with it. And I think, as you say, they wasted an awful lot of time on resolving this issue, and also the conference has been, in terms of the media, all focused on Andrew Rayner's comments.
Yes.
Which again is perhaps detracting from what Labour would like to put out, which is the fact they are trying to come up with policies with keynote speak. I think Ed Miliband spoke yesterday. Certainly Rachel Reeves has spoken today. Um,
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
perhaps these two sort of side issues have dominated how Labour
Yeah.
would have liked to portray themselves to
Hmm.
the public and potentially their voters. Interestingly,
Yeah.
this while I'm on a flow here, apparently the latest Mooring poll has put Johnson and Starmer as equal on 38% as being capable prime ministers. And it's the
Yeah.
first time since 2008 that a Labour leader has polled at least as equal as a Conservative leader. So Starmer,
Yes.
maybe, is he doing something right? I don't know.
Might be. I mean, as all Boris Johnson's doing something wrong, I suppose you could look at it either
Yeah,
way, couldn't
yeah,
you? I
flip,
mean,
flip the coin,
there,
yeah.
yeah, there's. I mean, obviously, there's a lot going on at the moment with the national insurance, the worries about fuel prices and fuel shortages, or whatever it is, panic buying or whatever. Um, so it could be a bit of both. I think the research for that, I had a quick look at that poll, was done kind of in the lead up to the conference, because you often talk about a conference bounce, don't you? And
Yeah,
parties hope to get a bit of a poll boost from conference because it gives them an opportunity to be seen and be reported more in the media than they perhaps normally are. But I think this bounce has come slightly before the conference. It'd be interesting to see in a day or two the next poll whether it's kind of maintained, or whether it's or whether it was an outlier or whatever. You don't know, but it is interesting, I think. That compared with the poll, so just as well as with we've got it there on the screen.
yeah,
The Labour up 6 points,
yeah.
compared with sometime in August, I think, the previous one, um, and the Conservatives down a couple. Um, but it is quite a it is it is from sort of last week sometime. So it's interesting to say whether is that
Yeah.
thanks to things that Keir Starmer and Labour have done, or is it more that that Boris Johnson's losing some support? Probably a bit of both, I suppose. We've got a comment here. How can the Labour Party
Yeah.
convince the
Go on.
45 to 85 age group who
Mm.
voted for Brexit, voted for the Tory Party, how can you get them to vote for the Labour Party in the next general election? This group is a huge percentage of the population. How can Labour Party turn this around? And as well as being a huge proportion of the population, they're also more likely to vote, aren't they? And they do vote in higher numbers. And so when you see those age pyramids, they're quite interesting, the voting, aren't they? That you know, both 2017 and 2019, obviously there's probably more marked in 2017, but both of them, younger age groups, Labour are winning by quite a large margin, and then Conservatives winning by a large margin among the higher age groups. The reason why that ends up with being quite a big Conservative win is that the older voters are voting more, aren't they? And as well as you say, a big percentage of the population. We have got an ageing population. How do you persuade them? Well, it was interesting. I noticed Hilary Benn today suggesting that the next
Yeah.
election should be fought about Brexit again. I'm not sure that's the. I'm not sure that would be my advice if I were doing them. But that maybe we should have another Brexit election. I guess about wanting to rejoin. I can see where he's coming from, because there's a lot of issues at the moment that relate to that. With
Yeah. Maybe rejoin a single market as
yes,
opposed to
yeah,
a,
yeah,
a full registration.
yeah.
I think
But
Labour need to target the Conservative policy on they are taking away the pension triple lock.
mhm,
They are, in terms of social care, saying that £86,000 will not have to be, you can have as a threshold.
yeah,
And again, that's a postcode lottery because you live in a wealthy area. The money you're left with is obviously hugely greater than if you live in a less wealthy
yeah,
area. So the things that the Conservatives are doing, which if
mm,
Labour really got to grips with it, they could actually
yeah.
say to this age group, they're not doing you the favours perhaps you think that they are.
No, it's interesting, isn't it? Because it seems like, at least, and it's obviously there are some of that age group who do vote. Don't all vote Conservative, but obviously they do have a big lead. But it's it seems like perhaps they're voting about other issues, maybe not just about the
Yeah,
kind of material type issues and things like patriotism and things like that. So there's kind of cultural stuff there as well. It's Because I mean, I suppose if you look at policy terms, I mean, Labour at the last couple of elections have said they're going to do something about social care and they protect pensions and that kind of thing. But for whatever reason, that hasn't been the story that people have heard, and they focus more on other aspects of it. But we are definitely drifting from the confrontations there, aren't we? But it's a very good question. I'm sure we'll revisit it about that voting
Can Labour
behaviour.
reconnect with the North and Scotland?
Yeah,
I mean, Labour won
absolutely.
the general election based on Scotland, and now they're run out of Scotland virtually.
Yeah, and I suppose the question is the sort of image that the Labour Party is putting across in their conference going to help with that or not? And I suppose part of the Keir Starmer wants to be seen to be being tough. His gamble is that people don't like, and there's lots of evidence for it, people didn't like the last few years, and so if he's shown to be different and changing, and it's going to be a different Labour Party, maybe that will get some people who voted Labour 97 to 2005-ish. But there is a risk, of course, that it doesn't achieve that, but it does put off some of the people who voted Labour in the last two elections. Who may become more interested in the Green Party or the Liberal Democrats or whatever. Who they might feel Labour's not speaking to them now. The Tory Party has 80 plus seats plus the majority. How can the Labour Party turn this around? That will have to be a question for another time, but it's a very good one. But you're right; it probably isn't a one election thing, which is a scary. Well, if you're
they're
depending on your
first
perspective.
past the post PR tonight, aren't they? I think
at the Labour Party conference, yes, and that will be an interesting thing to see if they push for proportional representation. That could be interesting.
Yeah.
Right, we've got another redacted one. Something outrage at US, UK, Australia Security Pact. Is someone going to chip in with suggesting what could be underneath that black strip? I can think of two possible countries that could be there. I know which one it is, but what do you reckon? Sorry, pardon me. Who's outraged at the new US, UK, Australia Security Pact? So this is a global politics topic. I know not everyone here will be doing global, but I mean we could link it a bit to the British government or some American government as well. Is it Beyonce who's furious about this? It could well be Beyonce, but it's actually the Chinese. It could have been the French, couldn't it? Because the French weren't happy about it because of the issue with the submarines. So this is a bit of global politics. It's quite an interesting one. You were close with Beyonce, well done. Yeah, but it's because it's a kind of mine's gone blank of the word, but it's a different gathering of countries. Yeah, yes. We're used to the EU and sort of Germany and France being very much at the centre of these sorts of things. NATO, being the focus of kind of security, but of course that's traditionally been with a view to being a bulwark against Russia, and Russia's been the focus. And perhaps here the focus is more about China, although some people have been coy about that. I think a couple of our ministers have been fairly upfront about seeing China as a threat. The Chinese aren't very happy about that characterization. It has also this thing about the submarines, because the Australians were going to had an arrangement with France about nuclear submarines, and now got an arrangement with America, and hasn't pleased the French very much at all.
So it's worth £27 billion apparently.
Yeah, so unsurprisingly that it's
a bit cheap stuff.
Yeah, understandably, really. And I suppose we can see it partly in this kind of, does it link possibly partly to Britain trying to find a new place for itself in the world post-Brexit and coming up with new, obviously it's not about trade particularly, although the French aspect of it is to a certain extent, but obviously we've always had the close alliance with America, but this sort of a post-Brexit world order as well, and so there's a few aspects to this, and also the growth of the idea of China being a threat, but also as a superpower, and having to look at kind of different power bases against China. So
I did this a little bit of background reading just because I thought that this may be one of the ones, and I did not realise how much it is to do with trading areas and military control of the South China Sea.
yes,
And
yes,
obviously, some people are beginning to concern whether China will attack Taiwan. But what I hadn't realised is China have a dispute within international law over who owns which territories in the South China Sea, to such an extent they are building artificial islands. So they have a greater claim of territory, and these islands, according to American intelligence, which is not normally something you put in one sentence, is actually saying that's because they're going to build more military bases there. Hence, we need this increased defence, hard power, if you like, in that particular vicinity. So interesting,
and I guess
days ahead.
I was just saying that's where it would kind of come into, wouldn't it? In sort of global politics questions, this idea of hard power, and is this about kind of avoiding conflict through a show of strength, if you like, a deterrent? Is it about preparing for possible conflict? We hope it's not that, but it's and are there alternatives to this? Is this kind of the realist sort of approach, and is there a more sort of liberal approach and all that kind of thing? So there's quite a lot in there, and then also we've got the thing about sort of multipolarity in the world and the growth of China as a significant global player. That America, Britain, and Australia feel the need to make a new pact. But also possibly about the decline of NATO. Is that potentially an issue there? Is NATO being sidelined a little here?
Yeah, you kind of think so, don't you? I mean, certainly Trump was sidelining NATO.
Yes.
And a lot of people are saying Biden, if anything, is more of an isolationist than Trump. What I hadn't realised that there's only into Australia, there's only 6 countries that have nuclear-powered submarines, of which India have one.
Yes.
Why do India want a nuclear-powered submarine?
Well,
I don't actually get it. United States are the most, apparently, with 68.
Yeah.
And we have 11, 4 of which have actually got nuclear weapons. Yes. Having watched Vigil for the last 6 weeks.
yeah, puts you off, doesn't it? Anyway.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, I think that was our last story. So I think we'll go back to the green room and see
the boss
phone with Jim. Yeah, there's also some links there, so you'll be able to download this document after we've finished if you want to, and you can link to some of the stories and find out more. Lots there.
Yeah, super, guys. Yeah, we'll post all those links onto the download, but also onto YouTube. So if you're watching this on catch up, lots and lots of students pick up on these bi-weekly sessions and like to follow up on the stories and add the details from the discussion and the articles into the notes. So we'll make sure we post those onto the recording of this session on YouTube. Fantastic. What a great start to the term. 4 meaty topics there. We've got a minute left. Clive, Duncan, predictions for the next 2 weeks? Give us something which we should look out for.
Kick back against the universal credit withdrawal of £20 a week and the end of furlough, which obviously also ties in with the Conservative conference. So there may be some Conservative Red Wall MPs in particular who may certainly go against that. And the other one might be the pressure group, Insulate Britain, who are causing chaos in the M25 for those people who actually can get petrol.
Yeah, true. I was going to go with Conservative Party conference, so I better come up with something else quick. I think, it'll be interesting to see what the political fallout of this issue with the petrol is going to be. I mean, whether we see anything particularly significant over the next 2 weeks. I suppose a lot will depend on how well it's resolved. If by the end of the week most people are able to buy petrol in the normal way and things have gone back to normal, then there probably won't be too big a political fallout from it. Interesting to see if that's kind of the way this goes, or whether it just gets back to normal anyway, and we don't need that. But interesting.
I guess it's possible Johnson could appoint a minister directly responsible for the fuel crisis. I don't know whether Jerry Can is available to step in. Whether there is an MP called Jerry Can.
Well, there was a
They should
BBC
be.
reporter called Phil McCann.
Phil McCann.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, Phil
He
McCann
was
was.
on yesterday. Bless him.
Whilst
Yeah,
we've been
so-
on, Halfords have announced that sales of jerry cans have increased by 1,600% in the last 4 days.
Miss that.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Well,
fantastic
someone's
stuff.
doing all right from it. Yeah.
Really fantastic. Duncan and the team who put the session together. Clive, of course, as well. Thanks, many thanks for joining us today. Hopefully you found it useful. And, well, it'll be in a couple of weeks' time. Next week for our live session, I think we're picking up a topic-based focus, aren't we, Duncan, in terms of...
Yeah.
Is
We're
it
going to be looking at
ideologies we're into?
Yeah, we're going to be starting to look at some ideologies. So I think we're starting with conservatism. I'll have to check my notes, but I think we
you're
are.
right.
So we'll be looking at some of that in next Monday. So
Fantastic. Well, if you want to get an alert on when that session's added and when it starts, just press the subscribe button on the YouTube channel and the bell icon if you'd like to be sent an alert when the session's scheduled and about to start. But hopefully that you found the session useful. So for now, we'll sign off and we'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.
bye.